The Ptolemies, the great Macedonian pharaohs of Egypt, are definitely one of the strongest factions in Divide Et Impera. They start out with one of the wealthiest provinces in the game and field a very well-rounded army. Simultaneously, this army only gets strong in the late game, and in the early game, the roster of the Ptolemies is very lackluster. This complicates an otherwise easy campaign because you will inevitably be thrust into many wars in early game. So in this guide, I'll show you how to survive the challenging early game for the Ptolemies and showcase why the Ptolemaic unit roster is a force to be reckoned with. Alright, so this is the start position for the Ptolemies. As you can see, you do have a variety of lands under your control right from the onset. One of the most out of any factions in the game. So you absolutely can't call this anything resembling a weak faction. This is a very strong faction, and it's strong from turn one. So you can see, you have all of Egypt under your control, all of Yehuda under your control, you have one settlement here in Galatia at Cappadocia, and you have two settlements here in Libya. Now, while all of these settlements do generate a decent amount of income for yourself, particularly because you have a bunch of wonders under your control from the onset, 3 wonders. Nobody else has 3 wonders under their control from turn 1. And these are very overpowered buildings. I mean, they grant you brilliant income, just a bunch of buffs, absolutely no debuffs. Like, literally, you really want to have these wonders, and they'll just help you throughout your entire campaign. But simultaneously, some of the lands that you're given, some of the territories that you have under your control are utterly useless. Like this random settlement Side in Galatia at Cappadocia, this will most likely just get you into wars. Like this thing, there's no way you're going to hold it down. This thing's going to rebel very quickly. And you might end up getting into a war with Galatia over this, or Cappadocia, or maybe even like the Lydians or something. So it's absolutely not worth it to try to defend this territory. It's basically gone. Like literally, Side is just a tripwire to make factions declare war on you. That's all it is. Now, when it comes to Yehuda, when I played as the Egyptians, I just basically ceded it to whatever factions wanted it. I didn't try to defend it because this entire province has horrible public order debuffs. Like, you have 0% Hellenistic population. 0. So you're just going to have horrible... Look at that. Minus 19 cultural differences. How are you going to overcome that? Because of that, you're never going to generate amazing income out of this. And the Seleucids, they will declare war on you, like, turn 1, turn 2. It's inevitable. Like, the Seleucids are meant to declare war on you. It's basically scripted war. And they'll immediately start pummeling you over here. So when I played as the Egyptians, I basically just decided to give up this. I just treated it as a really large speed bump to stop the Seleucids from actually attacking territory I cared about. And it basically just held them here. Basically just held them over here in Egypt because I knew that they weren't really going to cross the Nile and actually attack my important settlements. And what I did was I invested thoroughly in just building Egypt up. Like, I made it an incredibly solid, well-defended province. Just like an incredibly powerful place to hold the Seleucids at. Made sure that all my buildings are fully upgraded. Made sure that I had armies on standby. And I just conquered more locally. Like, I just went to Ethiopia, got the gold resource from Axum, finished my conquest of Libya as quickly as I could. And I just ignored Yehuda and ignored the Seleucids until they were basically at my doorstep, in which I just turned and used my newfound wealth from these conquests in order to batter the Seleucids into submission. And the Seleucids really can't take all too much of a battering, for if they're going to be at war with like everyone to their east and to their north at the same time. So they're not really going to trek all the way over here with like several armies, maybe just like one stack. And you can, at least I was able to retake Yehuda with ease against the Seleucids. Like, their control of the province was really poor. Really poor. I was able to just get right back in. But I did mention in my introduction that the initial forces that the Ptolemies have are quite lackluster. And I want to just demonstrate that. I mean, we have a level 1 barrack here, and this is not the type of faction that has several barracks for like cavalry and infantry, it just won. And look here, there's like nothing to recruit. Nothing to recruit. Other than pretty decent skirmishers and these Judean archers and slingers. The archers have 20 armor, which is pretty good for an early game unit. And I mean, these Judean slingers, I love using them in my campaign, man. 190 range is so good. And they do pretty good armor penetrating damage. And look at their melee armor penetrating damage. 15. If you use these guys to outflank like a heavily armored unit, like a phalangist or something, like a pike unit, you can actually do reasonable damage just in melee with the Judeans. Like, they won't kill it. They won't slaughter them. But they actually will be reasonably strong. And outside of this, you literally have 0 melee infantry options. That's not even hyperbole. You have 0. You have skirmishers. You have a crappy cavalry unit, just like a generic javelin cavalry with almost no armor. And, yeah, you have pikes. So this is that really bad early game army I was mentioning. And once you get to level 2, like most of these are reform units. I think the only thing that you gain here that you can actually recruit are these Thracian units. And again, this is going to take like 10 turns to get, because you need to do the research to get the upgraded building. And then you need to actually build it. And this is nothing special either. 10 armor, 9 and 9 melee attack and defense. Sure, their weapon damage and charge bonus is good, and they do some armor penetrating, but this is a very lackluster melee infantry unit at the end of the day. So even once you get to your level 2 barrack, there's actually like no good options. And oh, that was unscripted. That was a little bit of a gaffe, but you know what? I can just go and demonstrate the exact same principle here. Sure, in Judea, you do have these Cilician levies as a area recruitment unit, but regardless, there's still nothing. Actually, you know what? These guys are decent. You know what? For a levies unit, I think this is the best levy unit I've ever seen. Their stats are actually really good for a levy, although you can see they're like double the price to maintain than your typical crappy levy. So there is that. But here's the thing I wanted to demonstrate. You do have access to these Galatian mercenary spearmen virtually everywhere, and they actually are an absolute killer melee unit. So any melee competence that you have will basically be at the behest of these Galatian mercenaries. But considering that they're a mercenary and they just spawn randomly, it is a little bit hard to consistently recruit them. In fact, it's impossible. So that's really the struggle. And when it comes to wars, like, yeah, you're probably going to end up at war with the Seleucids, like, turn 2. You're already at war with Kyrene, and at least in my campaign, like, these Libyans declared war on me very opportunistically as well. I had people declare war on me to the south as well. Like, I was virtually surrounded, although many of these factions aren't all too competent, but still. You can have many, many enemies at once and not really the armies to properly combat them. But once you get your reforms, you'll find killing these foes to be quite easy, quite a simplistic task. So as long as you can survive to like turn 60 with Egypt intact, you should be good to go. But yeah, let's go look at this unit roster I've been hyping up and just demonstrate how much better it gets from this early game, which has a pretty bad Egyptian roster. So here we have it, boys, the Egyptian unit roster. Now, as I progress through these faction guides, what I want to do is to do comparative analysis within the different cultures that the factions are grouped into. Like, for example, the Ptolemies are a Diadochi faction. And I think the best way to demonstrate the competence of a roster is to compare them against the other Diadochi. Because ultimately, all the factions within a culture group are kind of going to be like different flavors of the same dish. If that makes sense. If we're all going to have pretty similar attributes, pretty similar competencies and weaknesses. However, we'll just have different variations of that. So to understand whether a faction is good or not, you have to know like whether that culture group itself has competent armies generally, and then be able to explain how this particular faction is different than the others in the culture group. When it comes to the Ptolemies, What their strength is definitely in the melee and spears. That's their main thing. Like, they have other areas where they have good units too, don't get me wrong. But ultimately, the things that they excel at is really, really based on their infantry here. Not for phalanxes, but all of the more loosely bound melee infantry type troops. So let's just go through what the Ptolemies have, and it'll become crystal clear why. So if we go for the generals, you don't really have any excellent or brilliant options. They're actually just very generic troops. Like, you have a Sacred Squadron. It's your basic Macedonian companion cavalry type unit. There isn't anything special about this one. It's a good unit, don't get me wrong, but it's just your basic companion cavalry. Otherwise, you have the Galatian Royal Guard. It's an elite sword. It's not the best elite sword in the game, but it's a very competent unit, don't get me wrong. You'll absolutely love using this unit, although I think it's only available in late game for the Ptolemies, so you won't be able to use them right away. And you have your Egyptian Royal Pikemen. It's an okay elite pike. It's actually one of the weaker ones, if I'm going to be completely honest, because of its 35 armor. 35 armor on an elite pike is not particularly good. 12 melee attack is good, and 14 melee defense is good as well. So, you know, when it comes to attacking, these pikes are going to be pretty good. They'll pack more of a punch on your regular pikes. However, their armor is quite poor, so they're not going to be awfully survivable. These guys do have 3 speed, though, so they are nimble on their feet. They are more maneuverable than your typical pike, but only has 2 movement speed. And when it comes to the melee infantry, the legendary melee infantry of the Ptolemies, they have some really good options. Not at the low tier, but at the high tier. We already mentioned these Thracian Cleric Falxmen. Extremely mediocre. For Thracian unit, they're just terrible. Ptolemaic Swordsmen, nothing special about these. They're like any Phrao sword type unit. Although 15 melee defense is not a bad stat, but these guys only have 15 armor, 46 morale. They do tend to shatter under pressure. Like, if you've ever used Phrao swords, you'll know about these guys. They just seem to have a knack for running away when you really don't want them to. Cretan infantry, I think these are just like a mercenary unit, so I'm not going to cover them. Galatian 4-axe swords, these guys are awesome. But they have the same armor as your elite pike. Combine that with 23 weapon damage, 14 melee attack. I mean, look, they're not the best 4-axe sword unit. I'll absolutely admit that. However, you can't really go wrong with these guys. But even better are these Roman traitor legionaries. They're the only successor faction to get a Roman style unit. Now, these guys, they're not going to compete with like Evocati cohort or the best of Roman infantry, but they're a good unit, man. Like, they're an absolutely solid Roman unit. Like, there's no scam when it comes to these guys. They're absolutely a great unit. And once you get 4-axe reforms, you're going to be able to recruit 8 of these guys, and they'll absolutely be a neat complement to anything else that you have. Now, the spears of the Ptolemies are even better than these options that you have up here. These Judean Pharaohs spears are available once you get the Pharaohs reforms, so from turn 60. And I used these guys so much in my campaign. They're such a useful unit, man. So I'm getting nostalgia just thinking about how reliable these guys were at all times. Like, they'll murder cavalry with a 17 bonus versus cavalry. Their stats are pretty decent. 7 attack, 17 defense, 18 charge, 22 weapon damage. These guys, like, all of these stats are competent. Very competent. And they're incredibly cost effective. Like, I think your upkeep on these guys in your campaign will just be like 100 something, like low 100s, like 120, maybe 150 once your Imperium goes up. But still, these guys are insanely versatile. They'll last a long time. 25 armor isn't bad. 44 morale is pretty good for a unit in mid-campaign. These guys are wonderful. I just recommend using these guys as like basically your support for your phalanxes throughout most of the campaign. They are such a clutch unit. These Galatian Cleric Spearmen, I kind of missed them. I mean, I just got excited about these guys because I literally recruited hundreds of these in my campaign. But these 2 units here, they're just not good. Like Carrion levies, look at these stats, are horrible. 8 armor, 6 attack, 12 defense. There's nothing good about these guys other than they are insanely cheap. Okay, they are like one of the cheapest levies you could possibly get. They are worse than like most levy units though. Like Syrian levies are better than these guys, alright? Like any Eastern cultured like levy unit will actually beat these guys in melee, but these guys do have 1 ammunition and are really cheap to recruit, so it's really the positive here. These Galatians, I didn't really use them a whole lot. Is what really scared me about them was the 8 armor, and they come from one of your like higher classes, at least they did when I played this campaign. To be fair, this unit actually did get buffed since the patch I played my campaign in. You now have 10 attack and 13 defense and 23 charge, plus melee AP. So these guys actually will do okay in a scrap if you charge them into like the rear of a unit or something like that. And they are cheap to maintain, so maybe consider them as that. Maybe consider bringing 1 or 2 just as like shock factor, just to kind of swing them around. You can kind of use them like Falxman, except for just way worse than Falxman, obviously. And once you get to the upper tier of these spears, you get really solid units. These Galatian 4X spearmen and these 4X spearmen. Now, the 4X spearmen, the regular ones, the Hellenistic ones, these guys are defensive, very defensive, right? Like high armor, high melee defense. They won't kill a ton in combat, but they'll last forever. The Galatians, they are more of a shock unit. I mean, 26 charge is crazy on a spear. I mean, 12 attacks really good for a spear as well. So if you kind of just get these guys into combat really effectively, just make sure to get your charge. Maybe the enemy doesn't charge you head on. These guys will absolutely slaughter. And these guys are great for flanks, for hammer and anvils and all of that stuff. So I really liked using the Galatian 4X spearmen. I found them to be extraordinarily effective, especially like against Roman style opponents and stuff like that, because you end up needing to attack. It's not really good when your infantry isn't capable of really killing anything, and with 8 melee attack, these guys are not going to kill much. And yeah, the Galatian mercenary spearmen, they're really good. They're really good early game and mid game, but by end game, 25 armor kind of holds them back. You have the same armor as the Judean Threo spears, and the Threo spears cost like half as much to maintain compared to these Galatian mercenaries. So yeah, like these guys are basically overpowered in early game, but they'll lose their appeal by late game where you're gonna want to use a lot more of these. Now going into the phalanxes, the Ptolemies have decent phalanxes, although not the best. Like we have a very varied selection, but they basically don't have the best version of anything. Now, we do have these native pikemen, which are recruitable from the population class 3. I don't think any other Diadochi faction has a pikeman that can be recruited from population 3, so that's an advantage. Although, these guys are not, like, good statistically. Like, these chosen ones, which are available once you get 4X reforms, have the same stats, pretty much, as your basic like Macedonian settler pikemen, but you have to wait all the way to the end of the game. And these guys are available turn 1. By the end of the game, you have better options than these guys. So like, yeah, like these guys, I mean, they'll do the job, okay? They'll hold the line against Romans and frontally attack them. They'll kill hoplites, they'll kill crappy infantry, but they're by no means world beaters. Now these guys, these are basically the default pikemen that the Ptolemies have. They are worse than the pikemen of other Diadochi factions. They're worse than the Seleucid pikemen, the Epirode pikemen. They're worse than the Macedonian pikemen. They are better than the Bactrians, but that's the only one that they're better than. And the reason why is they have slightly less armor. Like, it's not a dramatic difference, but they have like 5 less armor. So in a head-to-head fight, they will lose. I believe it's the same thing for these 4X pikemen. Believe it's the same thing for these 4X pikemen. They are a little bit worse than the 4X pikemen of other factions. We can see that here. Bronze shield, 38 armor. What about these guys? So it might be the same. 35 armor, so slightly less armor, just to ensure that these guys do lose the melee confrontation, because you're gonna win. You're gonna win with these like loose troops. You know, your spears, your swords, but you're gonna lose the pike fight against the Seleucids. They do have these Peltis pikemen. They're similar to the Macedonian Agema. They're worse statistically than the Ajima. But these guys, they fight with short pikes, as the name suggests. And the short pikes ensure that they're more flexible. They do damage quicker, actually. You can see 15 melee attack. I mean, that's higher than any other pike unit that you have. So these guys, they're more of like an offensive pike unit, but they will lose a head-on-head confrontation against an actual full-length pike because you just won't be able to reach your opponent. So you use these against like Roman legionaries, you use them against melee infantry, use them against elephants. Look at that, 40 bonus against elephants. These guys just slaughter elephants mercilessly. But yeah, then you have these elite pikes. Like I mentioned, they're worse than the elite pikes of other factions, just by a little bit though. They still play the role as elite pikes if you need them to. When it comes to missile infantry, the Ptolemies have some decent options, but by no means are they the best. They're just kind of middle of the row. Like for Peltis, they just have the generic Greek Peltis, nothing special. They have mercenary Cretans. I don't really count this because this is mercenary. Their Egyptian troops are cheap, but otherwise really uninspired. They're not really that good. Nubian archers, they're cheap and offer additional range, which is actually quite useful, I find. Also, notice that these Egyptian units and the Nubian ones have 150 men compared to the 131 that you have on average. So that is a nice little gimmick. It also means that these guys are going to die a little bit quicker, and given that they have no armor, that is a bit of a loss, but they also have more ammunition in total. Because this 15 ammunition is multiplied by the 150 men rather than the 131 that you typically have. So that's a little gimmick with these guys, and that will make them slightly more useful. These guys will probably lose a skirmish fight against another skirmish unit. However, when it comes to just shooting infantry, these guys are just more competent than typical because of us additional men. Yeah, the Cilician Peltis, really nothing special. Just a cheap Peltis. 1 armor is pretty bad. But 26 charge bonus and 18 weapon damage with 13 melee attack means that these guys use axes, and they are pretty good in melee for a skirmish unit. However, you really need to just charge them in the rear because frontally, the 1 armor will ensure that these guys rout really quickly. These guys will get smoked. The Judeans, they're just solid and really cost effective. I love these Judean units. Because 190 range and 11 missile damage just means that these are like pretty solid slingers. They're not the best slingers in the game, like they're not Balearics, they're not Rhodians, but they're so much cheaper than those. So these guys are just insanely cost effective and useful. Judean archers, I don't know, I didn't really use these guys in my campaign. They're just alright. They're just okay. They have less range than the Judean slingers, which is why I prefer the Judean slingers. They do typical damage when it comes to like archers. They all basically do the same damage. Yeah, the Judeans do 1 more than the Egyptian, but come on, 1 is not a big difference. But they do have 20 armor. So these archers do pack a decent amount of armor, and they are available from turn 1. So, you know, against like lightly armed Libyan and Nubian opponents, this armor might save their butts and make them really effective. Now, in my opinion, the cavalry component of the Ptolemaic roster is the weakest amongst all of the Diadochi. Maybe them and Epirus are vying for that last place spot, but yeah, like they just don't have good cavalry at all. Like these light armored units like the Sarissa Lancers, the Thracian light cavalry, they're just not very good. There's nothing special about these guys, absolutely nothing remarkable. They're just low tier options. I mean, look, this is a shock cavalry unit. Talking about the Sarissa Lancers, and any shock cavalry unit is useful if you can hammer an anvil with them, but still, they're a horrible cavalry unit when it comes to fighting other cav. They'll just get hunted down and slaughtered by virtually anything. Ptolemaic Spear Cav, really unremarkable. Basically like the citizen cavalry of the base game, just not good. Tarentine Cavalry, somewhat more useful, but this is not the one that has a lot of ammunition. This one has just 4 ammo. But 23 armor is okay. 39 morale is pretty tragic though. I don't know, man. This Tarentine Cavalry, it's an okay unit, but just the Seleucids, the Macedonians, Bactrians have so many amazing cavalry options, and this is just nothing special here. I could say the same thing about the Royal Squadron, and just your basic kind of like elite Hellenistic Lancer. Even the Athenians have an equivalent to that. Like it's really nothing special. These are just copies of your general unit. And I use these Lydian Cataphracts a lot because I found them pretty cost effective. And they're good on a rear charge, but ultimately they don't have I mean, it's just lackluster. Look at the melee defense, 4. There's just nothing in here that's amazing, and these guys are so freaking expensive. So if you want like top tier cavalry, you're never gonna get anything super heavy like a cataphract, and you're just gonna spend all your money on these sacred squadrons, which I just don't think is worth it. So just amongst these, like, you have okay cavalry options. You can win cavalry fights, especially with your amazing spears acting in support, but there's just nothing game winning here. Absolutely nothing. There's literally no reason to talk about this guy or this guy either. But when it comes to your elephant, these African elephants, I found them useless, personally. They're so much worse than Indian elephants. These elephants are puny, man. I just wouldn't use them. Yeah, but happens to be the Ptolemaic roster. You're going to mostly dominate over here in the melee infantry department. Your phalanxes are competent, although slightly weaker than the other successor factions, with the exception of Bactria. Your missiles, you do have competent, cost-effective options with the Judeans. That'll actually win you quite a few fights, as well as these Egyptians and Nubians, which are basically just counter-infantry missiles. Your cavalry, I mean, they can hold their own, they're useful as cavalry, like you have cavalry, but they're definitely the weakest amongst the Diadochi. And last but not least, let's talk about the faction bonuses that you get as the Ptolemies. Admittedly, faction bonuses are probably the least important amongst all the information here, but still, let's talk about it. The standard faction bonuses that all the Diadochi factions get is a -20 resistance to foreign occupation, which is useful because you're going to be managing mostly foreigners from the beginning of your game. So why not have easier public order? Just makes your life easier. As well as +10 morale for all units during battles against Hellenic factions, which means that if you invade Greece, you're going to have an easy time, but it's not really a super duper useful buff, to be honest, because there aren't a ton of Greek factions in your orbit. Now, when it comes to your other bonuses, increased research rate is just nice, just a convenience thing. An experienced rank for ship recruits. I mean, the Ptolemies do have an excellent navy. So, I mean, it's a useful buff. When I was playing my Ptolemaic campaign, I absolutely made use of my navy, and they did help me conquer quite a few settlements. So, why not just take some extra experience? But increased public order penalties due to presence of foreign cultures basically cancels out the Alexander's legacy buff. So yeah, I mean, this is not really good. The foreign dynasty debuff is quite annoying, but ultimately it's not really that bad. Like, in all honesty, all of these buffs and debuffs that you see here is kind of a net neutral thing. It's kind of meh. There's just not anything you need to worry about. So when it comes to ranking this faction, and I think that perhaps my ranking system from the last video was somewhat confused, so I'll explain it here. What I'm going to do is rank, firstly, how powerful the faction is in terms of military, how good their start position is, then afterwards, rate how much you should play this faction. Like, is it an exciting campaign? Is it an interesting campaign? And all these rankings will be out of 10. So when it comes to how powerful this faction is, I'm going to give him a solid 8 out of 10. They do have good melee options, however, those options pale in comparison to what's offered by Rome as well as some of the barbarian factions. But they are very strong for a Hellenistic faction. The pikemen are solid. You have good melee troop. You have good, skirmish troops. However, your cavalry is kind of bad. And that's why I'm going to only give them 8 out of 10, but they are still a very strong faction, a very well-rounded faction. Absolutely one of the strongest factions in the game. Also, what does enhance how powerful your faction is definitely their ability to afford large armies. It is really about wealth. Like, you can spam so many nice armies out as the Egyptians. In fact, wealth definitely does contribute to their military might as a whole. When it comes to their start position, I'm definitely going to rate the start position as a 9 out of 10. Because as long as you played smart, you can absolutely leverage the economic might of Egypt as a province to go wherever you want, to fund whatever conquest you desire. I mean, sure, you do end up at war, probably with the Libyans, with the Seleucids, maybe the Nubians. But You just have to play it smart, not overstretch yourself, and you'll be absolutely fine. It's a very strong start position. You have a lot of land to act as buffer for Egypt, which is really the only province that matters. You'll be absolutely fine. When it comes to how much you should play this campaign, I absolutely recommend it. 10 out of 10. It was really fun. It's cool to have to navigate the wars with the Seleucids, as well as just a fun roster to play with. Who doesn't like pikemen with barbarian support on the sides, with some Alexandrian cavalry charging the rear, and some really cost-effective Judean troops? I mean, just overall, it's a really fun faction. I highly recommend it. So yeah, that's my take on the Egyptians. I hope you liked the video. Please leave a like, leave a comment if you wish, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.